The United States, Canada, and Australia were like three brothers. They fought together in two world wars. They stood shoulder to shoulder in Korea and Afghanistan. They built intelligence networks so deeply intertwined that secrets flowed between them almost as easily as domestic memos. Through alliances like Five Eyes and defense frameworks such as AUKUS, they created a level of trust that most countries can only imagine. For decades, that trust was automatic. If Washington called, Ottawa and Canberra answered. If Canberra needed support in the Pacific, Washington showed up. If Canada pushed for coordinated sanctions or trade rules, the other two usually fell in line. It wasn't perfect, but it was predictable, stable, structured, and stability in global politics is currency. But today, that currency is being tested. When Australia invited Mark Carney to address Parliament in a high-profile joint session, an honor rarely extended beyond a sitting U.S. president, it wasn't just a diplomatic courtesy, it was a signal flare. A message broadcast not only to Ottawa, but to Washington. And the man in Washington right now is Donald Trump. To understand why this matters, you have to understand the moment we're living in. Trump's second term has been defined by aggressive tariff threats, transactional diplomacy, and a renewed push for what he calls economic sovereignty, a proposed 10% universal tariff, public pressure campaigns against allies, explicit demands that partners pay more for security guarantees. He frames it as leverage. His critics call it volatility. Markets call it risk. Behind closed doors, U.S. officials reportedly pressed Australia to align with Washington's trade posture against Canada. The message was simple: don't undercut American leverage. Don't legitimize Ottawa while tariff negotiations are unresolved. Stay unified. Instead, Australia did the opposite. They doubled down on Canada. The invitation to Carney wasn't just about optics, it was about architecture. It signaled that Canberra sees long-term value in diversifying its economic and strategic dependencies. It suggested that middle powers, countries strong enough to matter but not dominant enough to dictate, are beginning to network laterally, not vertically. For decades, the Anglosphere revolved around Washington. The U.S. was the hub. Everyone else was a spoke. Now the spokes are connecting. Look at the subtext of the Australian announcement. It emphasized Commonwealth partnership. It highlighted cooperation on critical minerals. It discussed shared economic resilience. What it did not emphasize was U.S. leadership. That omission is deafening. Consider the strategic backdrop. Under AUKUS, Australia is set to acquire nuclear-powered submarine capability with U.S. and British support. It's one of the most significant defense partnerships of the century. But Trump has publicly questioned whether allies are paying their fair share. He has floated renegotiations. He has suggested that agreements are conditional. Conditional defense is a contradiction in terms. So Australia has to think long-term. If security guarantees become bargaining chips, what is Plan B? If tariffs can be imposed overnight by executive order, what does that mean for supply chains? If intelligence sharing becomes politicized, what does that do to trust? Enter Carney. Unlike many career politicians, Carney built his reputation in global finance. He previously led both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. He understands capital flows, currency stability, commodity cycles. He speaks the language of markets as fluently as the language of diplomacy. That matters. Because this emerging Canada-Australia alignment isn't just political, it's economic. Together, Canada and Australia control substantial shares of the world's uranium, lithium, potash, gold, nickel, and rare earth elements. These aren't abstract resources. They are the backbone of the energy transition, advanced weapon systems, semiconductors, fertilizer production, and battery technology. Control over these inputs is leverage. If Washington decides to weaponize tariffs, Ottawa and Canberra don't have to respond with speeches or headlines. They can respond quietly, strategically, and effectively. Think coordination over confrontation. Preferential contracts can be written. Bilateral pricing mechanisms can be set up. Joint ventures can be prioritized so that Canadian and Australian firms benefit from each other first. Standards agreements can be negotiated to reduce dependence on U.S. regulatory frameworks. This is how economic blocs form, not with dramatic announcements, rallies, or press conferences, but through quiet, calculated alignment behind the scenes. It's subtle, almost invisible, yet far more powerful than a single tariff threat. The markets are already picking up on this. When rumors of Carney's visit started circulating, currency traders noticed relative strength in the Australian dollar versus the US dollar. Analysts interpreted it as a signal that global partners may be moving toward diversified supply chains, hedging against US trade volatility. This isn't just theory. Every contract, every standards agreement, every joint venture reduces leverage that one country, even the United States, can exert. And the more quietly and effectively it's done, the less media attention it draws while still reshaping the global economic map. The message is clear. Power in modern trade isn't about who can shout the loudest. It's about who can align networks, reduce vulnerabilities, and make moves that ripple through the system before anyone notices. Washington may threaten, but Ottawa and Canberra can respond with action that matters far more than any tweet or tariff proclamation. Markets hate unpredictability more than they hate almost anything. And Trump, whether supporters admit it or not, represents unpredictability. His response to the announcement was swift and emotional. Instead of diplomatic congratulations, he criticized both governments publicly. He accused allies of freeloading. He threatened to review aspects of cooperation. This is the pattern. Apply pressure. Expect compliance. Escalate if resisted. But what happens when resistance becomes coordinated? That's the inflection point we may be witnessing. Trump's worldview is transactional. Everything is a deal. Every handshake, every conversation, every alliance is measured in concessions and immediate gain. Relationships aren't long-term. They're individual contracts, one at a time, negotiable, expendable, replaceable. The formula is simple. Extract concessions, assert dominance, move on. In Trump's mind, America's size is leverage. The United States is the big player at the table. The logic follows that smaller partners can be isolated, pressured, and forced to comply because they need access to the American market. Threaten tariffs, impose restrictions, deliver ultimatums. Compliance is assumed. Victory is measured in immediate results. But not every country plays by that rulebook. Canada, Australia. These are not small, pliable partners. They are strong economies, capable of thinking strategically, capable of pushing back. They are also deeply connected, not just to the United States, but to Europe, to Asia, and to each other. Decisions made in Ottawa or Canberra ripple across continents. They aren't isolated actors. They are nodes in a network that extends far beyond the borders of North America or the Pacific. When Trump escalated tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum in previous cycles, it was supposed to intimidate, to bend Ottawa to his will. But what happened instead was far more complicated. Canada began looking elsewhere, Europe, Asia, even Latin America, for trade opportunities. Diversification became a strategy. The U.S. was no longer the only lifeline. The very pressure meant to coerce became a catalyst for independence. It wasn't just Canada. When Trump pressed NATO members on defense spending, threatening consequences for underpayment, European capitals didn't simply capitulate. They began whispering, quietly planning, questioning dependency. Conversations about strategic autonomy started to surface. Germany, France, Italy, each pondering, what if the U.S. isn't reliable? What if we need to be able to act independently? Every threat became a nudge toward redundancy. Trump's approach relies on fear and immediacy. Threaten today, extract tomorrow. But fear is fleeting, and immediacy doesn't account for foresight. When smaller partners realize that capitulation won't guarantee safety, they start hedging. When isolation is attempted, alliances strengthen. When ultimatums are given, strategies accelerate. And it's in those moments that the transactional worldview meets its limits. America may be big, America may be dominant. But influence isn't just about size. It's about integration, trust, and networks. Canada and Australia aren't negotiating as isolated pieces on a chessboard. They are watching, calculating, connecting, and planning a future that doesn't depend on American compliance. In the end, every act of pressure can backfire. Every tariff, every threat, every demand can produce the opposite of its intended effect. It doesn't bend the world to your will. It forces the world to adapt without you. This is the lesson of modern geopolitics. Transactional thinking works in theory, but not when your partners are anything but small. Not when they are connected, resilient, and capable of thinking in decades rather than news cycles. Not when your moves are being watched by allies and adversaries alike, all calculating how to reduce dependency on a volatile power. Trump assumed leverage, but leverage depends on dependence. And the world, especially Canada, Australia, and Europe, is quietly learning that dependence is negotiable, and defiance can be far more powerful than submission. Pressure, in other words, creates adaptation. Carney's approach is almost the inverse. Instead of threatening isolation, he offers integration. Instead of demanding loyalty, he proposes value. Instead of escalating rhetoric, he focuses on systems. That difference in style is strategic, because modern power is networked power. Aircraft carriers still matter, military budgets still matter, but so do semiconductor supply chains, so do rare earth processing facilities, so do cross-border energy grids. The future belongs to those who can guarantee continuity, and continuity requires trust. Australia's calculation appears to be this: the risk of angering Trump is temporary. The risk of over-reliance on volatile U.S. policy is structural. That's a profound shift. For American consumers and investors, this isn't abstract. If Canada and Australia deepen preferential trade arrangements, U.S. firms could face less favorable access to raw materials. If supply chains are reoriented to reduce U.S. exposure, production costs may rise domestically. If allies begin settling more trade in non-U.S. currencies, incremental pressure builds on dollar dominance. None of this happens overnight, but geopolitics is cumulative. Trust, once chipped away, doesn't snap back instantly. There's also the intelligence dimension. The Five Eyes Alliance, linking the US, Canada, Australia, the UK, and New Zealand, has long been considered the gold standard of intelligence cooperation. It functions on deep mutual confidence. If political disputes spill into that realm, if intelligence becomes leverage, damage could be lasting. Even hints of conditionality erode the foundation. That's why Scenario C, the militarized retaliation path, is so risky. Threatening intelligence or defense collaboration to punish diplomatic independence would fracture decades of institutional integration. Most analysts believe that scenario is unlikely, but the mere fact that it is discussed underscores the volatility of the moment. Meanwhile, Scenario A, targeted tariffs or public denunciations, is more plausible. But as noted, Australia appears prepared. Diversification is insurance. Scenario B, the domino effect, may be the most consequential. If other Commonwealth nations or key Asian partners interpret this Canada-Australia alignment as a viable hedge against U.S. unpredictability, momentum could build. The United Kingdom is watching, so is Japan. So are European Union policymakers navigating their own strategic autonomy debates. No one is declaring the end of American leadership, but many are quietly preparing for a world where it is less reliable. And that preparation, ironically, accelerates the very outcome Washington fears. Zoom out further. For decades, American global influence rested on three pillars: military supremacy, economic scale, and institutional trust. The first remains formidable. The second is still immense. The third is the one under strain. Institutional trust is subtle. It's not measured in GDP charts or missile counts. It's measured in assumptions that agreements will be honored, that policy shifts will be predictable, that disputes will be resolved through established channels. When leaders govern through surprise, allies compensate through diversification. That's not rebellion, it's risk management. Carney's trip to Canberra represents risk management at scale. It's a signal that middle powers can pool leverage, that they can coordinate resource strategies, that they can insulate themselves from superpower mood swings. Whether this ultimately strengthens global stability or fragments, it further depends on what happens next. If Washington recalibrates, reassures allies, clarifies commitments, tempers tariff rhetoric, the system may stabilize. If escalation continues, alignment among middle powers may deepen. And here's the deeper irony. Trump's stated objective has always been American strength. But strength in a networked world is relational. It's not just about dominance, it's about centrality. If partners increasingly build parallel channels, economic, diplomatic, regulatory, the United States becomes less central, not irrelevant, but less indispensable. That shift affects everything from currency flows to defense procurement. For ordinary Americans, the implications unfold gradually. Slightly higher input costs, slightly reduced export opportunities, slightly more volatile currency movements. None of it dramatic at first, all of it additive over time. Geopolitical realignments rarely announce themselves with fireworks. They begin with invitations, with joint statements, with handshake photos that seem routine. But sometimes those handshakes mark the moment when the gravitational center begins to move. So the real question isn't whether Australia betrayed the United States, nor whether Canada is building an anti-American bloc. It's whether the architecture of global cooperation is evolving in response to unpredictability. Is this a temporary spat, or the beginning of a post-assumption era, where U.S. leadership is no longer automatic but conditional? History suggests that alliances endure when they adapt. They fracture when they calcify. Right now, adaptation is happening, but not necessarily under Washington's direction. As Carney prepares to address Australia's parliament, the symbolism will be unmistakable. A Canadian Prime Minister speaking to one of America's closest allies at a moment of strategic uncertainty, not to attack the United States, but to coordinate without it. That distinction matters, because no one is declaring independence from Washington. They are declaring independence from volatility. And volatility in global systems is contagious. The coming weeks will test whether this moment becomes a footnote or a pivot point. Will tariffs escalate? Will rhetoric cool? Will other nations follow suit? One thing is certain: the era of unquestioned automatic alignment is over. In its place is negotiation, calculation, diversification. Three brothers are still in the same family, but one just realized the others have options. And in geopolitics, options are power.